While, however, the immediately universal individuality is perverted in the source of perversion, this universal ordinance, since it is the law of all hearts, that is, of what is perverted, is no less itself essentially perverted as the ravings of the deranged consciousness declared. On the one hand, this ordinance proves itself to be a law of all hearts by the resistance which the law of one individual heart encounters from other individuals. The established laws are defended against the law of an individual because they are not an unconscious, empty, and dead necessity, but a spiritual universality and substance, in which those in whom this spiritual substance has its actuality live as individuals and are conscious of themselves, so that even when they complain about this ordinance as if it went against their own inner law and maintain against it the opinions of the heart, they cling to it with their hearts as being their essential being. And if this ordinance is taken from them, or they place themselves outside it, they lose everything. Since it is precisely in this that the reality and power of public order consists, the latter thus appears as a self-identical essence alive in everyone, and individuality appears as its form. But this ordinance is equally a perversion. We arrive now at the last three paragraphs of this section, the law of the heart and the frenzy of self-conceit, in which the problematic situation is now going to be brought to the fore. And you notice that what we've got here is what we might call a rather pessimistic point of view, where on the one side we have the universal ordering, what Hegel is going to call public order, and also the established laws. And on the other side, we have the individual motivated by the law of the heart. You notice that we have perverted here, and we have perverted and perverting there. Both sides are equally screwed up, or at least screwed up enough. Perhaps this side is a bit more screwed up because it is engaged in actively perverting, right? But what have we arrived at? Well, earlier, just a few paragraphs leading up to this, we saw the development of a contradiction that could not be reconciled within consciousness, and the self-consciousness attempted to project it out onto the world, onto the society, and say, I'm pure, and that fell apart. And now that's been realized, and now it sort of shifts to the other side. Everything is screwed up. What can we draw from that? Hegel starts out by saying the immediately universal individuality, that's the human person who is motivated by the law of the heart, attempting to enact it, attempting to make it happen, you might say. They realize that this is perverted, that is, it is turned away. It's not perverted in the sense of sexual perversion necessarily, probably not in most cases, right? Unless we're talking about the domain of sexuality, or ways in which sexuality could intrude into, say, the economic domain or other things along these lines. But it realizes that there's something fundamentally wrong with it. Earlier, it saw this in terms of coming to terms with its own semi-insanity. It's the contradictions lying within it. So he says it's perverted, and it's also a source of perversion. Why? Because it realized that what was happening in the universal ordinance was in part, because it was universal, it was stemming from the universalization that occurs in any action that we engage in. So society being screwed up, I'm not totally responsible for that, but in a certain way, by wanting to make things happen and impose an order at all, I end up not identifying with, but becoming partly responsible, partly culpable, partly entangled in that. And he says, this universal ordinance, since it's the law of all hearts, that is, of what is perverted, is no less itself essentially perverted. That is, as the ravings of deranged consciousness declared. And that was, we have here both action and we have ravings, right? An acting in the world and a condemnation of the world. A condemnation of the world is screwed up, one that also, of course, turns in upon itself as well. Now, Hegel goes on and he says, on the one hand, this ordinance over here proves itself to be a law of all hearts by the resistance which the law of one individual heart encounters from other individuals. You remember several paragraphs ago when this person attempted to make the law of their heart into the universal ordinance, they ran into other people who were like, hey, wait a second. Who made you king? Who made you the ruler? Who left it up to you to decide what a heart actually desires? And we saw that there could be a clash between individual hearts. He goes on and he says, the established laws are defended against the law of an individual, somebody trying to change it. Why? Because they are not an unconscious, empty, and dead necessity. This is what we saw last paragraph, but a spiritual universality and substance. Now, this is very important. Now we're getting back to ethical substance in a very explicit way, what we were originally looking at early on in the introductory materials to this entire subsection. Hegel continues and he says, it's a spiritual universality and substance in which those in whom this spiritual substance has its actuality live as individuals and are conscious of themselves. This is something worth mulling over. So in the past, what we've been treating this as is we've got the universal ordering, and perhaps there's some individuals up on top running the show, the fanatical priests, the gluttonous tyrants, their minions who are looking to dominate somebody and accept domination as the coin that they have to pay. And then we have suffering humanity beneath. But that's not all that's going on. Even in societies that are genuinely screwed up, in which there are terrible abuses taking place, there's still this process of the spiritual substance constituting the very possibility of being of these individuals. I mean, you are an individual insofar as you're not just an individual and you exist as a part of something. Not merely a part, not just a cog in the machine, but you belong. It's like Aristotle said in the Politics, an isolated person is like one piece alone on a checkerboard. Now, it's not exactly checkers back in ancient Greece, but you get the point. There's no game, there's no meaning to the piece, totally isolated from itself. And that means that not only are these individuals encompassed within that, so is this one. So is the one who wanted to change things in accordance with the law of the heart. The principles that are flowing from the sentimentality that they are motivated by in an immediate way. So he goes on and he says, these individuals live as individuals and are conscious of themselves. Now notice the next thing that he says here. This is really brilliant. Even when they complain about this ordinance as if it went against their own inner law and maintain against it the opinions of the heart, they cling to it with their hearts as being their essential being. And if this ordinance is taken from them or they place themselves outside of it, they lose everything. People do bitch and gripe, and sometimes legitimately so, against the established order, against the way we do things, against society. And they don't realize in doing so quite often that they get to do that precisely because society does exist and provides a matrix within which that is a possibility for them. If they truly got what it was that they say that they want, they might find themselves entirely outside of it. This is what happens when you start thinking about utopian schemes and what it would be like if they were in fact enacted, how it would radically transform or destroy society and alter the nature of the human being. Or, Hegel might say, repress the nature of the human being. Another dynamic that comes up with this is when this person over here, very earnest, wanting to change things, sees these others complaining and saying, hey, we don't like the order that's there. Maybe they're not quite as serious about change as this person over here is. And so they enact it, and then these people are like, wait a second, we didn't want you to get rid of the ruling party. We didn't want you to change all the rules. We just had a few complaints. What you're putting in place is even worse. And then this person over here is, quite understandably upset because of that. So he goes on and he says, since it's precisely in this, what's the this? This relationship here. It's precisely in this that the reality and power of public order consist. The latter thus appears as the self-identical essence alive in everyone, and individuality appears as its form. This, not the law of the heart, is what is more real, more driving, more essential, and it's present in all of these hearts now as the individuality. And then he says, but this ordinance is equally a perversion. This does not get us through the actual problem, but now we see that things have sort of swung over to this side. The fact that it is a law of all hearts, that all individuals are immediately this universal, means that the ordinance is a reality which is only that of the individuality that is for itself, or as only the reality of the heart. The consciousness which sets up the law of its heart therefore meets with resistance from others because it contradicts the equally individual laws of their hearts. And these others in their resistance are doing nothing else but setting up and claiming validity for their own law. The universal that we have here is then only a universal resistance and struggle of all against one another, in which each claims validity for his own individuality, but at the same time does not succeed in his efforts, because each meets with the same resistance from the others and is nullified by their reciprocal resistance. What seems to be public order, then, is this universal state of war in which each wrests what he can for himself, executes justice on the individuality of others, and establishes his own, which is equally nullified through the action of the others. It is the way of the world, the show of an unchanging course that is only meant to be a universality, and whose content is rather the essenceless play of establishing and nullifying individualities. Paragraph 379 now ushers in a sort of unmasking, or if you like, in more technical terms, a dialectical analysis of society that shows that it's really a concealed state of war, at least at this point. Not every society in every way, but at least looked at this stage in terms of the law of the heart. So I got a lot of things crisscrossing on the board, and that's this resistance and conflict of laws of the heart coming into conflict with each other. So Hegel starts out by talking about the law of all hearts, this universal that we saw as, in the last paragraph, as being this universal substance, a spiritual substance. We could call it ethical substance if we like. And that's going to be shown as something other than what we take it to be. He says the fact that it is the law of all hearts, that all individuals are immediately this universal. Notice that key term there. All individuals are immediately this universal. They are not mediatedly through discipline, through connection with each other, but they're all striving to be that universal, to decide what counts as the universal in an immediate way, that is by relying on their own sentimentality, their own passions, their own emotions, their own desires, and then thinking that those somehow constitute, what is true. He goes on and he says, this means that the ordinance is a reality which is only that of the individuality that is for itself, or as only the reality of the heart. So what does this mean for us? This means that we don't really have a law of all hearts or a universal in play, even though everybody is striving for that and fighting with each other in order to establish it or to get control over it. So he goes on and he says, the consciousness which sets up the law of its heart, right? So we start with this one. This individual sets up the law of his heart as the universal, runs into resistance from others. Why? They have a law of their heart. He says, it contradicts the equally individual laws of their hearts. So everybody now has an idea about how things ought to work, who ought to be in charge, what mores ought to be respected, which ones we can dispense with, how we should interpret them, who should be ranked in what order, what counts as fairness. We could go on and on and on and on. And they all have feelings about it, right? They all feel quite strongly about it. Why do they feel strongly about it? They want things to go the way that seems fit to them. And it may not be, just brute egotism, right? We don't need to read a Hobbesian state of war of all against all here. But what we do need to recognize is that these people are in a competition with each other. It's no longer the struggle to the death of, the beginning of self-consciousness. No, it's mediated here in society, in who controls the language, who controls the discourse, who controls the mores, who controls the laws. And he goes on and he says, there's a contradiction with the equally individual laws of their hearts. These others in their resistance are doing nothing other than what this person is doing. They are setting up their own heart, crossing this. That's how I'm depicting it in two dimensions. They're crossing this one and going in a different way. And they're saying, no, not your heart, my heart. Not your way of looking at things, my way. And then this person does that in turn. And we have all these people over here doing the same thing. We could fill up the chalkboard with all the permutations of crisscrossing that could take place, right? And this is only with 6 people, right? And imagine we've got a whole society with 1,000 people all clamoring to have their own point of view heard. So he goes on and he says, the universal that we have here then is only a universal resistance and struggle of all against one another. So what's happening is we no longer have a universal that is constituting everybody and we can rely on. This universal is a locus for agonistic contestation, for debate, for rhetoric, for making deals and alliances, all these sorts of things that go along with situations of conflict like that. Wheeling and dealing, you might say. So what can we say after that then? So the universal we have is only a universal resistance. Each person claims validity for his own individuality, but at the same time does not succeed in his efforts. Nobody can get what they want in this case because nobody is actually willing to cooperate with the other person. They all want to be heard. They all want to have their point of view acknowledged by the other person. Remember, self-consciousness is interested in recognition from the other. But nobody's actually getting it here at this point. So why? In part because they're not giving it to anybody else, right? They're all competing with each other. So he says, what we have here is each meets with the same resistance and is nullified by the reciprocal resistance. So what seems to be public order then, what seems to be a workable society, is this universal state of war, in which, he says, each wrests what he can for himself, executes justice on the individuality of others, and establishes his own, and that is equally nullified through the action of the others. Hegel calls this the way of the world. And this is that proverbial, that's just the way things are. When we say this often out of a weariness or a despair, when we see that the world doesn't work the way that it should, that the universal order isn't one that's actually fair or even transparent to us, and we're like, yeah, okay, that's just the way it goes, right? We don't usually say that when things are going great. We don't say, oh, that's the way of the world. The world is just, this hunky-dory place where everybody gets what they want. No. We say that when things have turned into this morass of competing interests, and whoever wins may not be the person who deserves to win. So this is what we're going to be talking about quite a bit in the next section, the way of the world. What is the way of the world? The show of an unchanging course that is only meant to be a universality. What do we mean by that? There's an ideology, we might say, of universality. And by universality, we could talk about equality, fairness. We could talk about proportionality, anything that's principled. When we look at the way societies actually work and who gets things, who gets their point of view acknowledged, it never turns out to be totally in accordance with principle, does it? Even when we're trying to be descriptive and talk about ideal types, a la, Max Weber or somebody like that, it doesn't conform to that quite so well either. So he says it's only meant to be a universality, and whose content is rather the essenceless play of establishing and nullifying individualities. Now that's a very abstract way to talk at this point. What does Hegel mean? It means that these people are competing with each other over what we might call the space of public discourse, legislation, playing out interests. They are each attempting to impose the way that it looks like it ought to be for them, the way that things seem they would work best, what conforms to their heart, and they're meeting with this resistance from others that requires them to, in some ways, fight against those others. So what is this going to turn into? Well, let's look at the next and last paragraph. If we contrast the two sides of the Universal Ordinance, we see that this latter universality has for its content the restless individuality, which regards mere opinion or individuality as law, what is real as unreal, and what is unreal as real. But it is at the same time the side of the reality of the ordinance, for to it belongs the individuality's being for self. The other side is the universal in the form of a tranquil essence, but is for that very reason only something inner, which, though not absolutely non-existent, still has no reality and can itself become a reality only by getting rid of the individuality which has arrogated reality to itself. This shape of consciousness, which in the law is aware of itself, which knows itself and what is intrinsically true and good, not as an individuality, but only as it becomes an essential being, and which knows individuality to be perverted and the source of perversion, and therefore knows it must sacrifice the individuality of consciousness. This shape of consciousness is virtue. With paragraph 380, we now arrive at the very end of this section, and we're ready to make a transition into the next section, which is virtue, and something else that we referenced in the last paragraph, the way of the world. How do we get there? How do we wind up in a new shape, a new gestalt of consciousness? Well, Hegel begins this paragraph by talking about the Universal Ordinance, which we saw in the past paragraph was turning into a grounds of contestation. But now he's going to say that it splits itself off into these two sides. What we can recognize in here is, in some respects, a mirroring or at least an echo of the unhappy consciousness, right? Restless individuality, tranquil essence. Sounds very, very similar, doesn't it? There's even sacrifice going on. So, we should think back to that and see that as brought in here. He's also bringing up Aufhebung, sublation or transcendence, however you want to translate it, is being referenced here as well. So he says, if we contrast these two sides, we see that the latter universality has for its content the restless individuality, which regards mere opinion or individuality as law, what is real as unreal, and what is unreal as real. So it's conflicted within its very being. It's regarding what is real as unreal and vice versa. This goes back to the state of this frenzy of self-conceit, right? But now notice what else he's saying here. It regards opinion, meinen. And now Hegel's played a lot with this word, meinen. It does mean opinion, but it also means appropriation to oneself. It's my opinion, right? So opinion and individuality, Einzelheit, specificity, being on its own, right, as law. And we saw that there were some inherent contradictions in trying to elevate universality into a law, because it goes against this whole principle of ordering individualities in relation to each other. What do we have on the other side? So Hegel talks here about the side of the reality of the ordinance, right? That's this side, the being for self. This is what is real. This is what is ideal. And that doesn't mean that it's just some sort of pipe dream. He says that it's not yet real, but it is to be realized. Hegel doesn't look at ideals as things that we just have out there in Never Land, and we can just sort of approximate to them but never actually reach them. No, ideals become real by us realizing them, and there's usually some way in which that happens. So he talks here about the tranquil essence, and he says, this is the universal in the form. Notice this was content, this is form of a tranquil essence. And then he says, it is for that very reason only something inner. It needs to be externalized. It needs to be made outer. It needs to be made real. It is not yet real. So he says it still has no reality and can itself become a reality. How? It becomes a reality. Here Miller has unhappy translations. He says getting rid of the individuality, which is arrogated reality to itself. What Hegel is actually saying is it becomes a reality by sublation or sublating, Aufhebung, of the individuality, which has arrogated reality to itself. And how does it do so? It doesn't do so by some action on its own side. It does so precisely by this restless individuality doing something, which is a sacrifice. So he goes on and he says, this shape of consciousness, which in the law is aware of itself, which knows itself in what is intrinsically true and good, which is this, right? This restless individuality has realized itself as perversion and as having also perverted the Universal Ordinance. So the only way in which it can get in touch with what is true and what is good, which is what it thought it was in touch with the law of the heart, is by sacrificing its own individuality to become this tranquil essence. So he says it knows itself in what is intrinsically true and good, not as an individuality, but only as it becomes an essential being. And it knows individuality to be perverted and the source of perversion. Therefore, it knows it must sacrifice the individuality of consciousness. Hegel says this shape of consciousness is virtue, Tugend, something aiming at a universal that is not simply destroying the individual, right? But sublating it, raising it to a higher level where it's no longer just an individual struggling against a whole bunch of other individuals, but expressing, living out something different. And notice, this can only occur in this stage of the dialectic when the restless individuality comes to recognize itself as perverted and as the source of perversion, when it tries to actually, externalize the law of the heart into the organism of society and finds that there are all sorts of screwed up consequences, including turning the other laws of the heart against it. If it doesn't do that, it's not yet ready to have this raising up to a higher level occur and to have virtue. That's why virtue, and this is a little bit of a digression that I'm going to close on, that's why virtue so often is Pollyannish, what people call virtue signaling, right? Not real virtue. If it's real virtue, there is some sort of sacrifice, some subordination of the individuality to something higher than him or herself, which then incorporates them and turns them into something more than just their individuality. How is that going to play itself out? Well, that is what we have to see in the section yet to come. This is how the law of the heart founders, shipwrecks, if you like, in the course of the dialectic.